So in today's episode, we're going to discuss residual herbicides and why we utilize these in our weed control programs.
Yeah, Jared, what I like to tell people is that a good residual herbicide is really the foundation of your weed control program. When you start out with a quality residual, of course, what you're doing is you're setting yourself up for success for the rest of the year because you're controlling those weeds before they ever even emerge. And that is the best way to control a weed versus trying to control it after it's emerged. It's going to be more challenging. Preventing those weeds from ever coming out of the ground is really setting yourself up for success. And with a good residual herbicide, you're going to control those weeds for several weeks after that application. And that's going to provide you with flexibility and time on the back end to make that second application to where you can maybe work around some adverse weather, things like that. And you're not going to be driven by weed presence to make that second application. It really puts you in the driver's seat, which is what we really want with our weed control. And you're setting yourself up for success for the rest of the year.
Absolutely, Mike. And there's a lot of residual compounds on the market today, and they don't all act the same. Even within our portfolio, we see differences in length of residual and even maybe the spectrum of weeds that they control. And there are a lot of reasons behind that. So choosing the right residual is important. We'll talk a little bit about that here in this episode. But before we get there, I think I want to touch on more of the chemistry background, because there's a lot of people out there that talk about their herbicides being longer or whatever. I may have the longest half-life, or I may have the best solubility. You kind of hear these chemical terms get thrown around, but what does that really all boil down and mean? And I guess it all comes back to when you look at the actual chemistry, and there are some physical properties of that chemistry that influences how it acts and how it controls weeds. And three of those main factors I want to cover are soil binding, water solubility, and half-life. And those three things interact with each other to decide or determine how long these residual products last. So that soil binding is basically how tight the chemical adheres to the soil particles and stays in that soil profile. But if it binds too tightly, it's not available to the weeds. So there's a balance there. Secondly would be water solubility. We do need that water activation and rain to get herbicides going after we apply them, because we need it to get into solution so those weeds can suck them up. Sometimes too water soluble is not good, right? It limits how much is there and how much sticks in the soil profile. Sometimes not water soluble enough can hurt us in dry spells. So that all influences. And then last is the half-life, right? And that's the one that we often get to touch on the most, right? This compound is long-lasting in the soil, and it takes X amount of time before half of it's gone. That's what that half-life is. And really all three of these things have to interact. You can't just focus on any one piece of that, because if you do, you're going to maybe be misrepresented on what actually happens out there, because something that has a long half-life may be so water soluble that it's not in a zone where the plants can get it. So on a chemical standpoint, all of these factors influence how long that lasts. And at the end of the day, that's why we do our testing. We want to take that chemical interaction or understanding of that chemistry and really dial it into what we understand on how does it control the weeds, right?
Yeah, Jared, and I like that you said that those three aspects, you can't single out any one of them. It's a system. It's a combination of how those all work together. And that's absolutely true. But even when you bring it out a little further and take the chemical properties are just part of the puzzle as well, right? Another aspect of this and how long your residual lasts, and I know this is going to sound a little obvious, but it's the rate that you apply as well. So if you take a single product, let's take, for example, one of our residuals, Outlook. If you apply 8 ounces of Outlook, it's not going to have as long a residual as what 16 ounces of Outlook is. It's just more product is going to give you longer residual. I know, like I said, it sounds obvious, but it is another part of the puzzle. So that's something that we have to consider as well. And then when we're comparing rates of different products, now is when we start to get a little bit more complicated. You can't take a pint of product A and compare it to a pint of product B and expect to get the same amount of residual, because of all these other aspects are going to influence how long you're getting the residual from a pint of each product. So you can't make apples to oranges comparisons and expect to get the same result.
Right, and even the way products are loaded and how much active ingredient per jug, we just do need to make sure we're dialing them in apples to apples. And that's also why you hear us say useful rates too, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we want to make sure you're getting the most bang for your buck and really putting the correct rate out there and starting off with the most product to provide the safe and protective boundary that you need against those weeds that last the longest. That's why we're promoting full rates. And so at the end of the day, it sounds pretty simple, but it really is a key factor when it comes to residual length of herbicide. And then lastly is the stuff that's out of our control to some level, right? So the last factor that I want to touch on is soil type and weather. This is why sometimes when we get the call, Mike, well, how long does 12 ounces Outlook last? And our answer is typically, well, that depends, because there are some factors that also play into that on what speeds up some of these processes of breakdown and whatnot. So, depending on your soil type, you could take, the same rate applied here in Illinois as they might apply in Nebraska, and it might last different lengths, even if it's the same rate because of the weather and different things. So too much rain or too little rain can all influence on how long these residuals last. So I guess to sum up the "it depends" answer, what I always go to is typically university data and our research and our experience with this. And I can give you generally a good range, but pinning it down to the day is often pretty tough because of all these factors.
Absolutely, and it's not an exact science, right? We do the research to get our best estimate as to what kind of control you're going to get out of it, but you have to take all of those factors into consideration. And you mentioned placing the same rate of a product in 2 different places and expecting different results. That's why we create our local recommendations, and why I might recommend something different than what, Jared, you even recommend over in Missouri. Even though relatively we're kind of close to each other, we understand how they behave differently in our own environments. So that's why we have those locally recommended rates, and we take that, and when you're selecting a residual herbicide, take that into consideration, take the research into consideration to make sure that you're, first of all, choosing one that is going to be effective in quality and is also going to match the weed spectrum that you have in your field. Those are things that you really got to keep in mind. What are the weeds that you're trying to control? What are those driver weeds? And are you selecting a residual herbicide that is going to control those? And if you do that and you reach out to a BASF rep and make sure that you're using the locally recommended rate that they found to be successful for your area, you're really setting yourself up for that residual to set the foundation of your weed control program.
Yeah, and I think, Mike, just to kind of bring this to a close, if you haven't already explored some of the BASF options out there, we've got some great residual options in both corn and soybeans. And I'm just going to call a few of those out by name, being Verdict and Armazon Pro are such a staple combination or even option in your corn acre for that residual and to provide those clean fields. And then when we get into soybeans, you're looking at Zidua Pro, Zidua, and Outlook, and I would put those up against anything else in the industry as great options to keep your fields clean. So to kind of put this to a close, if you haven't talked about those options or you have more questions on what BASF can bring in the residual market, reach out to your local retailer or BASF rep, because I feel like we've got one of the best portfolios out here for providing clean fields when it comes to the residual aspect.
Couldn't agree more, Jared.
Hey folks, thanks for watching. The thoughts and comments expressed in these videos are the opinions of the Nozzlehead. Be sure to like and subscribe down below for new videos and content.